I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune, and I want to welcome you to this keynote conversation, one of 12 at the week-long 2021 Texas Tribune Festival. This is the 11th year our nonprofit news org has been convening the biggest names in politics and policy from across Texas and around the country to discuss the most pressing issues and the most interesting ideas of our day. At the Tribune, we believe events like this one are journalism, consistent with our public service mission to educate and engage our friends and neighbors. If you believe in that mission, if you believe a more informed Texas is a better Texas, consider becoming a Texas Tribune member. Go to texastribune.org/join to give during our fall drive, when the first $50,000 in contributions will be generously matched by our friends at the Lowy Law Firm in Austin. Whether or not you're a member, we're excited to have you join us for our latest and greatest TribFest program, which features more than 190 speakers and more than 60 compelling interviews and panel discussions. I think you'll especially enjoy this session, featuring the senior U.S. Senator from Texas, Republican John Cornyn, and Abby Livingston, the Texas Tribune's Washington, D.C. bureau chief.
Welcome. I'm Abby Livingston, the Washington bureau chief of the Texas Tribune. Joining me in this panel is Senator John Cornyn. Senator Cornyn is a longtime public servant in Texas politics, having served in many capacities, including the Texas Supreme Court, and he was at the vanguard of the Republican takeover of the state as Attorney General. And in 2002, he was elected to the Senate, and he is serving in his fourth term. Because of term limits, he is unable to continue his service in leadership, but previously he was the Senate Majority Whip. And in that role, if my research is correct, he is the highest-ranking Texan in the Senate since Lyndon Baines Johnson. So joining me is Senator Cornyn. Welcome, sir.
Thanks, Abby. Good to be with you.
Thank you. So my first question for you is one that I have been asked for almost a year, and I think you're the perfect person to answer it. You led the charge for Republicans last fall in the election as the senator at the top of the ballot. And you were very concerned and you rang the alarm for the entire 2 years of that cycle. We live in a world where people tend to vote their party and that's it. But there were quite a few Joe Biden, John Cornyn voters, and that probably saved a lot of down ballot seats. What did Republicans do right last year?
Well, I think we heeded the warning of the 2018 election that was very close between Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz. And frankly, we'd been sort of living off of our, off of jet fumes in terms of the preparation for the cycle. And I really thought we had to get back to basics, things like voter registration, things like organizing voter ID and to get out the vote. And as you know, there are incredible tools now that are available to help identify potential voters, like-minded individuals. And so we basically came up with a plan, a 2-year plan, and we executed the plan successfully. We registered more than 220,000 new Republican voters. And unlike our Democratic counterparts, we actually had an active in-person and virtual get out the vote effort, which paid great dividends. So, and the last thing I would say, Abby, you might find it interesting. We knew that there was going to be a challenge for suburban women. We knew President Trump was particularly challenged when it came to his appeal to suburban women. So we focused a lot of our paid media message on suburban women. Things like the work we've done to eliminate the rape kit backlog, things like the anti-human trafficking effort, the mental health trying to address the mental health crises in the country and in the state, and do things like working together on a bipartisan basis to pass laws that improve the background check system for firearms purchases, respecting the Second Amendment, but also recognizing that certain people should not have access to guns under current law.
So the other question I am asked 5 times a day, every single day for the last few weeks is about this abortion law in the state legislature. And you're a federal guy, and I don't want to get too into the weeds, but you're pretty steeped in the law. You have a law degree and a master's of law. Is this a well-written bill?
Well, you're right. I didn't have anything to do with the writing of the bill. I think, obviously, Roe versus Wade, even Justice Ginsburg questioned later in life whether the Supreme Court should have waded into such a controversial and polarizing issue at the national level, or rather let this work out state by state. The Supreme Court has granted a writ in the Mississippi case, which is a 15-week gestational age limitation on abortion. Most countries in the world have at least a 20-week limitation, excepting, I think, maybe 7 or 9 countries like Iran, North Korea, China, and the like. So even Roe versus Wade recognized that at some point in the gestation of this unborn child, that it had some rights that could be protected by the state and limits on abortion. So I don't expect the Supreme Court to directly take up and consider the Texas law. I think the law, what they write in the Mississippi case, will largely dispose of the Texas case. So I don't expect them to hear that independently. But I think I'm unapologetically pro-life. I do believe an unborn child has rights that should be protected. We've recognized this for late-term abortions and the like. But in the end, the Supreme Court is not final because it's right. It's right because it's final, in the words of a Supreme Court justice. So they will have the final word.
So I've been in politics for 15 years, and the border has bedeviled every Congress I've ever covered and every president I've ever covered. Why is this problem so hard to solve?
In this current crisis, I would say, Joe Biden was determined to undo everything President Trump did, whether it's the Remain in Mexico policy or the enhanced border infrastructure along or whatever it was relating to immigration. Look, my position as a Texan is we are the beneficiaries of legal immigration, not only in Texas, but in this country. This is really, in many ways, what makes us so dynamic and so unique. And I applaud legal immigration. We naturalize about 1 million citizens a year, and that's a unequivocally positive thing. But what you see now at the border is in the hands of cartels and other criminal organizations that care nothing about the people. They're in it for the money, and it's a pretty good business for them. And unfortunately, President Biden has been unwilling to take up and consider bipartisan proposals like my bill with Senator Sinema, Tony Gonzalez, and Henry Cuellar in the House, our bipartisan border solutions bill, to try to provide some tools to offer some deterrence from illegal immigration, while it offers an opportunity for some due process for people who have legitimate asylum claims. But right now, the Biden administration seems to be completely flummoxed and not really understand the dynamics of the border. Meanwhile, we have thousands and thousands of Haitians showing up in Del Rio, and they seem to be clueless as to what to do about it.
You mentioned Senator Sinema, the senior senator in Arizona. I've covered her a long time, and is she your best friend who's a Democrat in the Senate?
Well, she certainly is a friend, and I think as a border state senator, somebody who understands many of the issues that we deal with in Texas. I recently, as you probably remember, I flew out to Tucson to be with her at the Arizona border. It's a much different border than ours, which is why I was glad she came with me to the Valley, Rio Grande Valley, to see the Texas border and see how different it was. And we've worked together on this bipartisan piece of legislation. I suspect it will not be the last we work on. I find her to be very smart, very determined. I know she can be the bane of the Democratic leadership right now, particularly on this big spending and tax bill. But I like her, and happy to find common cause with her on some of these issues. Well, and you mentioned the spending bills that Democrats are pushing through the Congress. And I'll ask you the same question I asked Kevin Brady.
when Democrats come into office, they raise spending, and when Republicans come into office, they cut taxes, and the deficit keeps growing.
Right.
Am I the last person in America who worries about this?
I hope not. Maybe you and I may be the last people that worry about it. But the debt used to be a bipartisan concern. And, right now, following COVID-19 and the extraordinary measures we had to undertake in order to deal with the public health and the economic crisis associated with it, we racked up debt like we did after World War II or during World War II. I think last time I heard it was 107% of GDP. And somebody's going to have to pay that money back. And I think the Democrats think, well, we're going to raise taxes and pay it back. Republicans say, no, we're going to cut spending. And you're right. This gets to be sort of a push and pull, a tug of war, and nothing gets done. I've long time been a supporter of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution because, frankly, I think Republicans and Democrats both have have less than clean hands in dealing with this issue. And it's frankly is getting to a point now where I think it's starting to get kind of scary. You see what's happened with the other crises we've had now, the refugee crisis out of Afghanistan and other things, and racking up all this debt really makes it less possible for us to deal with future crises, like, let's say, the financial crisis we had in 2008, 2009. So I think it's very dangerous. And I think we need to try to take some common sense measures to deal with it.
Well, and you mentioned Afghanistan, and obviously President Biden has come under a hail of criticism for the withdrawal. And I interviewed probably a month ago, Congresswoman Escobar, and she made an interesting point. This war has been going on for 20 years, and there is congressional oversight of these things. Could Congress have done anything either when President Trump was negotiating the withdrawal or ahead of the Biden withdrawal to mitigate the images that we saw those first few days and the problems that are still there?
Well, the problem is President Biden didn't consult with us, the Congress. And I recently was traveling in Europe and talking to some of our NATO allies. They are completely scandalized by the fact that even our NATO allies in Europe who were cooperating with us in this mission, they didn't know. They didn't get any notice or no consultation. And we've seen the disastrous consequences of establishing an arbitrary deadline, and everything else is not. There's no other consideration given to the other chaos and the potential consequences of what we saw. So Congress does have oversight when it comes to military conflict. It's primarily the power of the purse. As you know, the War Powers Act has been debated ever since it was passed, and it's a constant back and forth. Congress has issued an authorization for the use of military force. It could have modified that. It could have repealed it. But the Biden administration didn't even consult with Congress. And you can see the reaction from even my Democratic colleagues that they think this was an international embarrassment and completely unnecessary.
With those authorizations from the early war on terror, I had forgotten that the Afghanistan one didn't even mention Afghanistan. And now there's the movement to roll back those powers. What if we get in a situation where we need to use forces overseas? What is going to be your perspective having gone through this for 20 years on what kind of language you would want to see in a war authorization bill?
Well, these things change over time, and you're right. Really, the authorization had to do with the war on terrorism or the war on terror and Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. And as you know, the terrorist threat has morphed over time. Once Al-Qaeda seems to be contained, then it springs back in the form of ISIS. And we then went back in the previous administration, General Mattis taking the lead, and we destroyed ISIS. And after a bloody and difficult battle in Mosul and elsewhere. So I have no doubt that the terrorist threat is not going away. The Taliban, I don't think we should trust the Taliban's tender mercies when it comes to protecting our interests. That's what reason I believe that we should have maintained a small footprint there, let's say 2,500 troops to stabilize the region rather than to pull the plug and create this chaos.
Well, and you've been critical of Biden in this interview and in past statements, particularly with Afghanistan. But you did serve with him for 6 years. What's your relationship with him like going back to the Senate?
Well, he's a nice guy. You can't help but like him. He kind of reminds me of Joe Manchin that way. But I have very different policy views than Vice President Biden or President Biden now. And so there are some sharp differences, but that hasn't stopped us from working together where we can. As you probably remember, I am one of the leading sponsors of a bill to try to reshore semiconductor manufacturing in the United States, working with Mark Warner, my counterpart, Democratic counterpart from Virginia, working with Michael McCaul in the House and a Congresswoman from California. We've had meetings over at the White House, and the White House is all on board. The Secretary of Commerce have done public events with her. This vulnerability was really exposed in COVID-19 when I got a call from, or I called Governor Abbott and I said, well, what do you need to deal with COVID? He said, testing and PPE. And I said, well, what is PPE? He said, personal protective equipment. I said, oh, I got it. I understand. And all of it was made in China. And so that demonstrated that this idea that just because it's cheaper to make things in China or overseas isn't the end of the story. And particularly when 90% of the semiconductors made in the world are made in Asia, 63% are made in Taiwan. And then you know how fraught the relationship between mainland China and Taiwan is and what the potential for disruption of that supply chain would mean. I mean, these are the chips that power everything from your iPhone to the fifth generation strike fighter F-35. So I'm just mentioning that as an example of I don't let partisan differences or ideological differences or even personalities limit the people I'm willing to work with. I'm willing to work with virtually anybody who has common cause and who's willing to work with me to solve the problems that we can solve, recognizing that there's going to be a big gulf between us on many other issues.
Well, and I think Americans are still getting to know another former senator, Vice President Harris. What was it like serving with her?
Well, it was sort of a blink of an eye, and she was gone. She came to the Senate, and she was trying to use the Barack Obama playbook, come to the Senate, and then run for president. She's not the only one who's done that. There have been Republicans that have done that as well. But she did not have, in my observation, much of a legislative record. It seemed to me like she came to the Senate in order to run for the White House, and she did, and she ended up being vice president, and good for her. I don't think she has been a credit to the administration. When she was appointed border czar, she immediately rejected the idea she would even travel to the border to learn more about it. And, I just don't think there's any excuse for people who are unwilling to learn about, from the experts on the ground, people like the Border Patrol and the representatives of the Health and Human Services about, okay, here's the problem, here are the facts, and let's figure out together how to provide a solution. She seems completely unwilling to do that, and I am not. I'm not a fan.
And you are a senior member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is where Supreme Court hearings happen. What kind of nominee would President Biden have to put forward to get your vote if a vacancy occurs?
Well, I've voted for some nominees of this administration, as you know. As you pointed out, I've been a judge for 13 years, 6 years as a district judge in San Antonio, 7 years on the Supreme Court, 4 years as Attorney General. I'm pretty steeped. My DNA is pretty much steeped in the law, and that's kind of who I am. And so I recognize that everybody comes to the job of judging with a different life experience, maybe different political attitudes. But to me, the litmus test is, will people follow the law as written and not make it up as they go along? And there's nothing worse in my mind than a political federal judge because you can't unelect them. You can't do anything about them. Potentially, you could impeach them, but that doesn't happen. So that's what I would focus on Biden's Supreme Court nominees should a vacancy occur. I voted for some of his judicial nominees already for circuit courts and district courts, of course, and I'll continue to take them on a case-by-case basis.
I've started reading the 9/11 report, and I was not expecting it to be as well written and a gripping read as it is. And as we've gone through the 20th anniversary of September 11th, there's been a lot of discussion about how that's the gold standard of what government can do, and that there were changes made to prevent something like that from happening again. And that was the model for how to address the insurrection. And Republicans in the Senate voted against that, a commission to understand why that happened. Can you help us understand why Republicans were opposed to that?
Well, I originally supported the idea of a 9/11 type commission to look into and report on the January the 6th incident at the Congress, but it became quickly clear that this was not 2001, and the country and our politics are so polarized that this is going to be used as a political weapon in the 2022 election. And I didn't think it was appropriate to use the commission for partisan purposes. And I also recognize that there is an alternative, and that is to let the standing committees in the Senate and in the House do their job. And they have produced, as you know, a report from the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, as well as the Rules Committee on what's happened. And the Department of Justice and the FBI have investigated and indeed gotten convictions in a number of cases. I have no doubt that we will have a lot of clarity, complete clarity, really, on the causes and what exactly happened that day. But I really regret the fact that almost everything seems to be used as a partisan cudgel these days, and I feared that this commission would be used for that purpose and would not support it.
And I want to turn to another, I think it falls in judiciary, voting access. And Texas is at the center of that battle as well. Is there any provision that you would support that would reinstate portions of the Voting Rights Act?
Well, just to be specific, Abby, as you know, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is still the law of the land. The part that was held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the Shelby County case, was the preclearance requirements based on a formula that was dated back to 1965. When we reauthorized the Voting Rights Act a few years back, I was one of the authors of a report, a minority report, really, I guess, or we may have called it Additional Views, which questioned the failure to use updated voting statistics in order to determine which states and counties and local jurisdictions would be covered by this preclearance requirement. Because as the Supreme Court's noted, the federal government's intrusion in state voting laws is constitutional only as a remedy for past discrimination. And the truth is that the Voting Rights Act has been one of the most successful laws that Congress has ever passed. We saw 11.3 million Texans vote this last election, historic numbers of minority voters, Hispanics and African Americans, 66%, I think it was, of registered voters. So the Voting Rights Act has worked, and where there are violations of voting rights, then Section 2 provides the means for the Biden administration's Justice Department to bring suit to remedy those. So I just don't think there's any excuse anymore for the federal government to basically hold hostage the states when it comes to wanting to change the hours of voting or how many days of early voting there are going to be, as long as it does not diminish the rights of qualified voters to vote. I think they are perfectly acceptable.
So you have held positions of leadership. You're very well regarded among your Republican colleagues. Is there a chance in the future Texas could have a leader in the Senate?
Are you talking about succeeding Senator McConnell?
If he was to step down.
Well, it's been my honor to work with Senator McConnell, who's been in the Senate a lot longer than I have, and he is a legislative tactician par excellence. I mean, he understands the Senate better than anybody, and as long as he wants to be the leader, then I will continue to support him, and because I think he's been extraordinarily effective. But should he decide to step down and no longer serve as leader, I've made it no secret that I would like to succeed him. I've worked in the Senate for now 3 terms. I've learned a lot. I've developed good relationships, I think, with not just Republicans, but with Democrats as well. I think that's based on mutual trust in a place where trust is in short supply. People know me. So, yeah, if there's an opportunity to do that, I would like to do that. And, it would be the first majority leader in the Senate from Texas since LBJ.
And I probably didn't set that up correctly. You were one of his top lieutenants. So, yeah. My last question for you is, I'm going to turn it back to my first question. Which way do you think the political winds are blowing at this point, going for the next year? Like, do you have a sense at this point?
Yeah, I think, President Biden's, the honeymoon's over. And with the debacles like we see at the border and we see with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think people are correctly questioning the competence of this administration to actually execute the laws. And then historically, in the first midterm, as you know, the party out of power sees a big shift in the House, particularly some 25 or more seats, together with reapportionment following the census and the redistricting process, which is underway right now. I expect Republicans to be in the majority in the House. And so that'll be the first firewall against bad policy coming out of the last 2 years, the first term of the Biden administration. But I think the Senate has a good chance of getting back. We have a good chance of getting back in the majority. The big challenge we have, as you know, is the retirements. Really outstanding senators like Senator Toomey from Pennsylvania, Blunt from Missouri, Portman from Ohio, Shelby from Alabama, Burr from North Carolina. And we still don't know what Senator Grassley from Iowa is going to do. I think his 88th birthday is coming up. Maybe it's just occurred, but he is not missing a step. And then Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. So we're going to have a lot of primaries. And one thing I learned from my experience as chairman of the Senatorial Committee years ago is it matters who wins the primary, because if we nominate people who can't get elected in November, it's all for naught. And so my hope and prayer and all of my efforts are going to be is encourage good people to run and get nominated as Republicans so we can have a chance to regain the majority in November.
I want to follow up on that. You ran the GOP campaign committee in some of the toughest years, and I never heard anyone blame you for seats y'all didn't get because of these candidates who were nominated. How much control does the party have over that process at this 10 years later?
Honestly, not a lot. Most of those are going to be determined by, at state by state level. President Trump's involvement in endorsing some candidates is going to be a factor. I don't think it's necessarily dispositive. I've always thought that elections are won by, a combination of 3 things: the quality of the candidate, the issues, and the resources if they have the resources they need in order to defend themselves and get their message out. So I think it's too early to tell exactly what that's going to look like. But as you can imagine, it's awkward and maybe impossible for the Senatorial Committee or others, official committees, to weigh in these contested primaries. So I expect you'll see others like the super PACs and things like that weigh in. The fact is that now people can raise a lot of money online without regard to political party organizations, and the super PACs operate sort of independently. So that's the world in which I think this is all going to be litigated.
Well, that is all the time we have. And so thank you so much, Senator Cornyn, for your time and your willingness to chat with us. And I thank our audience for tuning in.
Thanks, Abby.
Thank you.